A warm welcome to everybody that's joined us here at the University of Wolverhampton. As Verity said, we've lots of sites across the West Midlands at Walsall, Wolverhampton, Telford, and of course at Stafford. And it's the fact that we're based in Stafford that gave me the idea to do this talk today, and that is the economic history of Josiah Wedgwood in 5 buildings. And this is Josiah Wedgwood I, who was born in 1730 and died in 1795. He is an endlessly fascinating character from many perspectives, from the aesthetics and the art of ceramics through to the absolute incredible impact he had on business, and of course on the potteries, the area in which he was born, Stoke-on-Trent. Although when Josiah Wedgwood was born, it was a scattered collection of isolated hamlets that grew into be the federated city of Stoke-on-Trent in 1910, obviously a long time after he was after he died. So, as way of introduction, let's have a look at the man. But let's start at the end. Josiah Wedgwood, as I said, was a huge figure in politics, in business, in commerce, actually in international relations too. We'll touch upon that briefly in today's lecture. But he was essentially a master potter. He was a ceramic chemist. He was an inventor. He invented the pyrometer. He gave a talk at the Royal Society about how to judge temperatures in kilns at extreme temperatures. He was the creator of unique and bespoke earthenware, was an inspirational designer of surface patterns and shapes. He was an innovative marketeer, and he was a business leader par excellence. For instance, he was a member of what was called the Lunar Society that had Erasmus Darwin, Joseph Priestley, James Watt, Matthew Boulton, and others who met every 4 weeks on the full moon so that they could get back to their places of work with some degree of light if the moon was around. Very influential in the Renaissance of the West Midlands and England more generally. So by his death, he was a Queen's potter to Queen Charlotte, George III's wife. His company sold products in humble homes and regal houses across Europe, as well as exported to China, the birthplace of pottery, India and America. And the key thing here to remember that when Josiah Wedgwood was born, people tended to eat off either wooden plates or pewter plates. By the time he died, this is the level of influence he had, people were starting in large and greater numbers to eat off pottery, of porcelain, ceramic or earthenware. So that just shows a measure of how he influenced not just the high and mighty, the regal houses of Europe, but also more humble abodes. And here he is. It's hard not to eulogize Josiah Wedgwood. The historian Brian Dolan called him the first tycoon. He was an incredibly charismatic figure. He turned scattered hamlets in Stoke-on-Trent and North Staffordshire into a booming powerhouse, probably one of the first industrial cities in the world. He connected it not just within itself, but to the great ports of Liverpool and to Hull. He connected it to Manchester and Birmingham and the markets that were emerging there. So it's easy to get carried away and to place on the shoulders of Wedgwood all these great things that were abounding in the Industrial Revolution. But what I want to do today is strike more of a note of caution and to have more circumspect and trying to put into context what he achieved. So the title is An Economic History of Josiah Wedgwood. in 5 buildings. I'm going to smuggle some economic theory into today's lecture, so be watchful of that. And I'm going to do it in 5 buildings, not because this is an architectural history of Wedgwood or even a history of ceramic art. I'll leave that to people who have much more knowledge in the area. What I aim to do here is put a spotlight and provide a concise history, an economic history of Wedgwood using 5 buildings, most of which are directly attributable to him and his enterprises, and all of which are still standing to a lesser or greater extent. And if we look at an economic history of somebody like Wedgwood, we would typically do that by looking at profit. How much money did he make? The processes, what did he do that changed things? The products that he created, and of course the people around him. One of the things that Josiah Wedgwood was extremely adept at was connecting people, artists, workers, people of influence, business leaders, merchants. But what I want to do is to put this in the context of place, and those 5 buildings represent the places that I want to look at. At the end, we'll have a question and answer session, which you're welcome to join in. So there are a number of themes that I want us to consider. We'll do this towards the end of the lecture. And the 5 themes I thought are all around this alliteration of M for no reason. Then I could put 5 things around the letter M. The first related themes are as follows: money. Where did Wedgwood get his finance? Materials. What was the supply chain like? Manufacturing. What did he do that created his products? Movement. Of course, if you're making things, you need to get raw materials in and the finished product out. And then finally, something that was burgeoning and beginning with Wedgwood, namely marketing. A contemporary of Josiah Wedgwood is the remarkable economist Adam Smith, born in Kirkcaldy and a professor of political economy at the University of Glasgow. They still have the Adam Smith Business School there. Adam Smith was a strange individual, to put it mildly. He was a contemporary of Wedgwood, as I mentioned, but in his famous work, The Wealth of Nations, written in 1776, which is right at the height of Wedgwood's prowess and influence, he doesn't mention him once. That would be a little bit like writing a book on economics today and not mentioning Bill Gates or Steve Jobs or Mark Zuckerberg. It's quite remarkable that this 700-800 page tome on the economic history, development and progress of the world's economy up to 1776 does not mention the first industrialist, possibly the first tycoon, and one of the greatest business minds of his generation and possibly since. Why that is probably reflects the quirky nature of Adam Smith. As I said, he's known as the father of economics, but perhaps that's only because of the context. Namely, The Wealth of Nations is a difficult read, it's impenetrable in places, and not only that, it didn't sell very well at the beginning, and it only started to sell a little bit later, a decade or so after its first publication, because the authorities in Great Britain wanted to use this work as a bulwark against rising revolutionary fervor in France and the newly independent United States of America. Leaving that context aside, what the work does is give us a number of key themes which are still taught in economic courses today, namely the division of labour. I mentioned at the beginning Wedgwood was a master potter. What that means is that he would have served, and indeed did, a 7 to 10 year apprenticeship in which all aspects of the production of pottery was at his behest, and he had to learn how to shape the clay, how to grind the flint to make the bodies, to do the firing of the glazes and the surface patterns. He would have had apprentices and he would have had labourers working around him. Essentially, a master potter harks back to the medieval period, that somebody has a skill and a craft, but they don't do it on a mass production scale. What division of labour does is to break those tasks down into the smallest divisible unit so that it can be easily replicated in order to generate scale in a factory setting rather than a domestic setting. The other element from the Wealth of Nations is this of price competition. In other words, there isn't a single butcher or a single baker or a single brewer in a town or village. There are many, and they compete with each other, and the way they compete with each other is on price, and that tends to provide an efficient outcome. The third area from the Wealth of Nations is the removal of monopoly. Prior to the mid to late 18th century, most commercial enterprises were state-owned or extremely small. So the East India Company that operated out of the East India Dock in London, for example, was a state monopoly, and it was able to import things like tea and china and porcelain and silk with a state monopoly, the blessing from the state. In other words, there was no competition. There was no way that they would feel the heat of that competition in order to reduce their prices. The other two areas are closely related, namely free trade, which Josiah Wedgwood desperately wanted with the French to export the products that he's made, for example, and commercial treaties. Interestingly, Wedgwood was involved in this as well. He led a consortium of pottery manufacturers from North Staffordshire and textile manufacturers, cotton textile manufacturers from Manchester to press the government, Pitt the Younger, in order to give them greater access to foreign markets and for foreign markets to come into the UK, because this suited Wedgwood because he knew that he could compete. So these are all the things that were in the Wealth of Nation and many others that Wedgwood was doing before the publication of Wealth of Nations. He was doing this as a matter of course. So already we're beginning to establish a picture of an individual who was ahead of his time. He was leading these profound forces, and the profound forces effectively are this, that the end of the medieval period into the 18th century marked the end of what was called a mercantile system, which was based on non-scale production, non-price competition, monopoly, a lack of free trade, and a free-for-all on international exchange of goods and services. So what did Wedgwood do? He had an interesting upbringing. He was one of 13 children, I believe. His father died when he was about 9, and he became apprenticed to his older brother Thomas. By all accounts, his older brother Thomas wasn't quite the guardian angel that a young Josiah needed. He did give him an apprenticeship, but it's widely believed that the £20 he inherited off his father did not go to him directly, but more on that later. In the early 1700s, as noted by Daniel Defoe, the area of North Staffordshire was effectively a very agricultural area, very rudimentary. The main trade route was through the Weaver navigation, a river system, and the main things that were being exported to this period was things like Cheshire cheese, which is why there's a very famous pub in London called the Cheshire Cheese on Fleet Street. the contribution of local potters was to make these rather coarse salt glazed earthenwares in which the Cheshire cheese and butter and other such products were exported down to London, often by pack horse. The achievement of Wedgwood, and indeed many other potters that were contemporary, including Josiah Spode, who's tragically overlooked because he was a phenomenal potter of his own right. Together, they were able to transform the area into this hive of business, exporting about 84% by the 1880s of their products, and this surely must rank as one of the greatest entrepreneurial feats of all time, to go from a fairly standing start to a huge hive of activity. And in so doing, they fashioned the beginning of modernity. In other words, style and fashion were starting to get all important after the Restoration, following the putting back the monarchy with Charles II, and establishing a reputation for research and development, for innovation. Jasperware, for example, which is one of the first unique pieces of pottery production ever made since the Chinese invented porcelain 5,000 years ago, was created by 10,000 pieces of experimentation before it was finally completed. And when the Prime Minister William Gladstone opened the Wedgwood Institute in Burslem in the 1860s, he coined the phrase that Wedgwood had united art with industry. In other words, the work of famous artists such as John Flaxman, as well as the endeavour of the mass production pottery. So that's by way of context. Here are the 5 buildings, and we're going to begin with theme number 1. Theme number 1 is money. And if anyone has been to this corner of Cheshire, you'll see there in the middle distance of that picture, the spire of St. Mary's Church in a tiny little hamlet called Osprey. And there it is again on a rather slate grey afternoon when I visited a few weeks ago. So, theme number 1, building number 1. Theme number 1 is money. Building number 1 is St. Mary's Church, Osprey in Cheshire. Now, this is located just into the Cheshire countryside from North Staffordshire. And specifically, it's about 1 or 2 miles south of Congleton, close to a little farming area called Spen Green. And this is where a lady called Sarah Wedgwood grew up. As you can imagine, she's got the same surname. That's because Josiah Wedgwood married one of his cousins. I think Sarah was his 3rd cousin. Not his 3rd cousin, a 3rd cousin, I mean. Cousin of a cousin of a cousin. Her father, Richard Wedgwood, was a local cheese factor, which is a cheese merchant that I mentioned that was making these butter and cheeses in the rich agricultural area of Stoke, and then using Staffordshire, coarse Staffordshire pottery before Wedgwood to transport it. Josiah and Sarah married here in January 1764. Why is that important? It's important because Josiah belonged to the poor side of the Wedgwood family. Sarah did not. She brought a dowry with her, and although known as Sally, their marriage was based on one of love and respect. He admired her enormously, and her business acumen is not to be underestimated. She provided the money, a small fortune that probably helped construct the Etruria works that we're going to come on to next, as well as their family home, Etruria Hall. Without her money, Wedgwood would not have been able, in all probability, to succeed as quickly as he did. We know he inherited £20 on the death of his father. He almost certainly did not receive that. What he did receive is this small fortune by marrying Sally, and by the time of his death, he left an absolute small fortune, a huge fortune, sorry, no small fortune, a huge one, of £500,000 in 1795, which is worth many, many tens of millions in today's value. Theme number 2 is materials. If anyone can spot what that is, that there, the bridge, is what's called Three Shires Head. It's where Staffordshire, Cheshire and Derbyshire meet, just north of the town of Leek in Staffordshire. Now, this is building number 2. It's still here. It's Jesse Shirley's Bone and Flint Mill in Etruria in Stoke-on-Trent. Now, it was built in 1856 to 57, as we said, long after Josiah Wedgwood had died, a couple of generations later. The reason it's in here is A, it's still standing, you can still go, but B, it shows how Wedgwood developed the supply chain. So clay is not enough to give an earthenware body enough strength. So they grind bone and flint. If you do that in a dry process, the dust is breathed in by the potters and it causes potter's rot, silicosis, and many of the potters died very tragically young. If you grind that flint and bone in a wet process, it reduces silicosis and is able then to be added to the clay, to be fired, to be decorated, to be glazed. So building number 2, Jesse Shirley's Jesse Shirley's Bone and Flint Mill, is here to show 2 things. One, the influence of Wedgwood, because as you can see, it's on the side of a canal, which he helped to construct, more on that later. And secondly, it exemplifies the expansion of the supply chain. Wedgwood was able to develop mass production, and so were the other potters, like Josiah Spode and Minton and others over the course of the next 250 years. And the reason I mentioned Three Shire Heads is because Staffordshire was not only brilliantly located in terms of equidistant between Manchester and Birmingham and close to the port of Liverpool, but it was also able to use local materials. Clay under the ground at Staffordshire for the body clays and the saggers, the parcel boxes that they used to stack the kilns to fire the earthenware in, lead from Derbyshire and salt from Cheshire. Salt glaze gives it an orange hue, for example, although that quickly died out. Theme number 3, manufacturing. If anybody recognises that picture there, it is the old Etruria works of Josiah Wedgwood and Company. I love this picture. I think it's absolutely fantastic. And it shows the division of labour. If you look, the tunnel into the kilns, that was where the saggers were stacked in readiness for the firing. And you can see the firing holes on the left-hand kiln there. The steps to the left of that would have gone to a different workshop. It might have been the Slip House Works, where they added water to the clay and the silica. The steps to the right, I'm surmising here, but presumably that was to a decorating room or a corridor to an adjoining room where surface patterns were added. And in effect, what this picture shows is division of labour. You've not got a master potter spinning a wheel, forming clay to be fired in a kiln the size of a family oven. These bottle ovens are on an industrial scale. They are fabulously huge and they get the scale that required by Wedgwood. But you can see That's only achieved through the division of labour. So the third building then is the Roundhouse in Etruria. This little building here is the last remnant of the original Wedgwood factory. It was sadly, in my opinion, demolished, although it could even have fallen down because it was over 200 years old. And they moved south to Barlaston to a purpose-built greenfield site, which is where they are still now. What this little roundhouse was used for is any number of reasons, but it was effectively part of the expansive development of works that had the main ovens, the calcifying ovens, and the glossed ovens, which were all part of the production process. Still there today on the side of the canal by the modern day Bet 365 building. So what Wedgwood's mass production at Etruria spelt, along with the work of Matthew Bolton at the Soho Works in Birmingham, he produced nuts and bolts and those sorts of things, was effectively the end of mercantilism, this small-scale, non-price competition, free-for-all and industrial production and international trade, and the beginnings of modern-day capitalism. The way Wedgwood did that, as you can see from that picture there previously, it's by establishing a rigorous routine. Wedgwood is responsible for the beginnings of cost accounting, factory discipline, timekeeping, health and safety, stock taking. He even gave money back guarantees and showrooms. All of these can be traced to Wedgwood. In other words, he ended, along with his contemporary industrialists, the craft system, and provided a disconnect in production from the actual workers themselves. They were not present at the beginning, the middle, and the end of the production of pottery. They were only in it for a small incremental part, the sum of which was greater than the sum of the parts. Theme number 4, movement. You can see there, that is the Trent and Mersey Canal. I've mentioned it a couple of times already. Those are a couple of old bottle kilns. There were about 2,000 bottle kilns in Stoke-on-Trent at the height of production in the interwar period. The Clean Air Act of 1957 put an end to that, and they have all been replaced by gas ovens or electric ovens. But the ghosts of the past still haunt the landscape of Stoke-on-Trent, not only the canal, but those bottle kilns there. There's about 45 to 50 of them left, none of them actually working as such, but they're still standing. They are beautiful shaped objects of our industrial past. Anybody that knows me was sure to predict that at some point I would put a pub into the proceedings, and I haven't disappointed. This is the Leopard Pub in Burslem. Let me mention this quote here. This is from Josiah Wedgwood himself. He was an inveterate letter writer to his friend and colleague Thomas Bentley. So, on Friday last, I dined with Mr. Brindley, the Duke of Bridgewater's engineer, after which we had a meeting at the Leopard, the subject of the navigation from Hull to Burslem. Josiah Wedgwood, 11th of March, 1765. So this building is where Josiah Wedgwood began the process of building a canal using the very famous 18th century canal engineer, James Brindley. Now, James Brindley had a fascinating career. He was born in a tiny hamlet in Derbyshire, was apprenticed at a watermill in Leek, Staffordshire, and his first piece of industrial engineering was in my hometown. I come from a part of northwest Manchester called Swinton and Pendlebury. And in the corner of Swinton and Pendlebury is a town called Clifton. And what James Brindley did, he reduced the water level in a colliery called the Wet Earth Colliery, a colliery which L.S. Lowry, the famous 20th century artist, has painted. He reduced the water level in the Wet Earth Colliery to such an extent that they were absolutely delighted with the results. He was then commissioned to help the Duke of Bridgewater, Francis Egerton, make the first commercially successful canal in Britain. Obviously, canals go back to the Chinese time, and Canal de Midi in the south of France predates the Bridgewater Canal, but this was the first done for a industrial purpose. And what it was the coal mines in Worsley were able to use the canal to ship their bulky cargo to the growing industrial metropolis of Manchester. Wedgwood visited the Bridgewater Canal and so devised he wanted to build what he called the Grand Trunk Canal, which is 93 miles that would connect Liverpool through Stoke-on-Trent into the network of rivers further south. It was a monumental task to simply get the Acts of Parliament, but Wedgwood pushed that through, given his incredible business acumen. And the idea for this was because the first thing that Wedgwood did actually was successfully champion the improvement of turnpikes from Stoke-on-Trent area to places like Leek and Newcastle under Lyme. So he knew the importance of transport because that enabled goods and services to go in and out. Theme number 5, marketing. And building number 5 is Wedgwood Mews in Greek Street, London. Around 1774, Wedgwood took lease on number 12 Greek Street. I think it's 12 to 14 Greek Street. And this was a property in a very fashionable area of London in which he had these events, not unlike the launch of an Apple iPhone. You know, everything's been done many times before, often centuries before, and this is no exception. One example, later in 1774, the dinner service, the famous dinner service made for the Empress Catherine of Russia to St. Petersburg, he displayed all the pieces of that pottery that had very famous English landscapes that were drawn by people like John Flaxman. But these events were incredible occasions in which the high society in London, and this was his idea. He wanted to get his ware, which he stamped with a W on the back, the first branding in modern history, with Wedgwood and his signature on some of the pieces. He wanted to put those on the crown heads of Europe so that the aspiring middle class, with their rising incomes, could also buy other pieces of Wedgwood pottery and vases and dinner services for their high table and their high dining. Simple plan, very effective. The picture here is the remnants of Wedgwood Mews on Greek Street, which is where these showcase. They had several of them. It wasn't just one. This was during construction last year. They've kept the frontage, but they're rebuilding behind. So with his partner, a Liverpool merchant called Thomas Bentley, I've mentioned him before, he created things like direct mailing, illustrated catalogues, money-back guarantees, travelling salesmen with display boxes and patterns, free delivery, buy one, get one free, all germinated from this fifth building. So there are the 5 buildings that I hope give you an outline of what we've done here. My final comments are this, that the economic history of Wedgwood still resonates with us today, 250 years later. Not only did he promote the division of labour and price competition at the beginning of capitalism and the end of mercantilism. But he also pioneered marketing, cost accounting, supply chains, before even these terms were widely known. And just to summarise, he was this: he was a restless entrepreneur, a ruthless connector of ideas, and a relentless capitalist in the pursuit of profit. Two key references if you're interested: a wonderful book, A Story of Creation and Innovation, Wedgwood by Gay Blake Roberts, and that's recently, and I mentioned him earlier, Brian Dolan, Josiah Wedgwood, Entrepreneur to the Enlightenment.